Okay, so what we're going to watch here is another clip from the Cessationist film. And I actually think that what John Piper has to say here is interesting. And you'd think that it would at least be food for thought for cessationists, but instead they just dismiss it out of hand because it goes against their presuppositions. So let's let them respond to Piper, and then I will respond to them.
What do you mean by speaking in tongues?
My sense is from reading 1 Corinthians 12 that it was more of an ecstatic utterance that didn't have any ordinary human meaning, but tongues of men and of angels, tongues of angels.
Often people will appeal to 1 Corinthians 13, where the Apostle Paul says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, then the practice of speaking in tongues is not suddenly speaking French or suddenly speaking German, but speaking allegedly the tongues of angels. You can literally say whatever you want and justify it. When Paul is speaking of tongues of men and of angels, what he's trying to do is speak in hyperbole or intentional exaggeration for the sake of effect to illustrate the point that even if you have the best and the highest gifts that reach up to heaven itself, and you have not love, you have nothing. For example, he says, even if I give my body to be burned, but I have not love, it profits me nothing. Not that you ought to speak in tongues of angels, but that you ought to love one another as Christ has loved you. And that's the stress of the text. It's actually sad and unfortunate that while Paul is seeking to direct our attention away from the gifts and to the grace of love, we take one phrase, the tongues of angels, and make it the primary focus of what tongue speaking should look like.
What's sad and unfortunate is that in a discourse where Paul is talking about how the gifts ought to operate in the church, in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, and he's explaining how those gifts work through love for the edification of the body, cessationists are claiming that Paul is seeking to direct our attention away from the gifts. He's doing no such thing. Look, cessationists might have a problem with gifts of the Spirit like tongues, but Paul did not. To Paul, all of God's gifts are given for the common good. They aren't curses or burdens. They're nothing to be embarrassed by. They're gifts. And they are one of the very ways that we express love in the church. 1 Corinthians 13 is not a standalone treatise on the subject of love. Paul is giving it in the context of explaining how the gifts of the Spirit edify the body. Now, I agree that Paul's probably using hyperbole here when he talks about the tongues of angels. But at the same time, if the tongues that Paul was talking about in Corinth were just like French or German, then why would we need a supernatural gift of interpretation to understand them? They didn't need a gift of interpretation on the day of Pentecost, did they? No, because everyone heard them in their own languages. So obviously Paul must be talking about something else. Now maybe you say, well, tongues are always ordinary recognizable languages like German or French or whatever. It's just that there might not be anybody in the room at the moment that understands those languages, and that's why the gift of interpretation is needed. But don't you think that God knows what languages the other people in the room speak? He didn't seem to have trouble figuring this out on the day of Pentecost when people, it says, heard them in their own languages. And you know what? If nobody speaks the languages naturally and they need a supernatural gift of interpretation anyway, then why does God need to bother giving them languages they recognize? Maybe God is giving them heavenly languages, or maybe God is praying through them in some unrecognizable language, or a dead language, or a rare language. What difference does it make? It's not for human ears anyways. You know, I've been to over 80 countries in the world, and I've heard some weird-sounding languages. Why should we assume that God is restricted to something that we would recognize? The idea that if it doesn't sound like German or French, it's not a language, that's just silly and ignorant. And it's even more silly to think that you know what the Holy Spirit is doing with and in people when they're speaking in tongues. Sometimes it's better just to be quiet and admit that you don't know what you're talking about.
1 Corinthians 14's rules for the use of tongues in church are simply ignored in our day in continuationist churches. The fact that only 2 or 3 tongue speakers should speak, they weren't to be trampling on each other and standing up and babbling at the same time. The fact that Paul says in the context there that women should not speak in tongues in church, those tongues had to be interpreted or they were not to be permitted. There are these rules that Paul gives that are widely ignored, and this is just another sign that what's going on is not biblical tongues.
Look, cessationists don't believe that tongues are for today. They think the gift has ceased, which means that they think that all the instructions Paul gives regarding tongues in 1 Corinthians are completely irrelevant. They've essentially thrown out entire chapters of the Bible, and yet they want to lecture charismatics about not obeying certain interpretations of the chapters that they threw out completely. Hey, what about the command not to forbid tongues? What about the command not to despise prophecy? What about the command to earnestly desire to prophesy? The Apostle Paul told the Corinthians, I speak in tongues more than all of you, and then he proceeded to give them instructions in the exercise of the gift. Cessationists say, we don't believe that tongues are real, but we're going to tell you how they ought to work. Why should we listen to people like that? Cessationists have no credibility and no authority in this area. They've given it up by their rejection, denial, and disobedience of the very texts that they're pontificating about.